Earlier this month, Mr. President, I had a chance to visit Cuba with a delegation of senators and House members. We met with Cuban Archbishop Jaime Ortega, who shared the wonderful story of Pope Francis's efforts to improve relations between the U.S. and Cuba and to secure the release of the American prisoner, Alan Gross. We met with many Cuban reformers and activists, Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez, foreign ambassadors from many countries, various ministry officials, agriculture, telecommunications, science, technology, environment, all areas of considerable potential for the greater U.S.-Cuban cooperation. Our visit came a month after President Obama secured the release of Alan Gross and made the historic decision to restore full diplomatic relations with Cuba and begin rolling back over 50 years of failed policies toward that island. As I've said many times, I'm not a fan of the Castro regime. It has a troubling history of human rights abuse and suppressing peaceful political dissent. It has squandered the talents of so many of its own people with a frozen economic and political system. And it's refused to provide full and independent accounting of the tragic death of Cuban activist and patriot Oswaldo Paya. But I've also argued that our policy toward Cuba, one that has spanned 11 different United States presidents, has failed and failed miserably to bring about reform and change in Cuba. Our policy towards Cuba has also hurt the United States and our diplomatic standing in the rest of Latin America and the Caribbean, where many, fairly or unfairly, regard U.S.-Cuban policy as an outdated relic of the Cold War. So I was delighted and fully supportive when President Obama took this bold move. During my visit, I could already see the dividends, most notably in the expressions of hope of the Cuban people. You go down the streets of Havana now, and on their pedicabs are American flags. That would have been unthinkable 2 months ago. Now it is part of their statement that it's time for a new relationship between Cuba and the United States. As one Cuban activist told me, starkly, her talks with others around the island highlighted something she thought had been lost to the Cuban people, a sense of hope. Mr. President, we need to do all we can to fulfill the hopes of the Cuban people, and one easy way is to provide greater engagement with America, with ideas, with energy, with the vibrancy that our nation can offer. I'm going to join today with my colleagues, Republican Senators Flake, Enzi, and Moran, and Bozeman, as well as Democratic Senators Leahy, Udall, and Whitehouse in introducing legislation that will lift the remaining travel restrictions on American travel to Cuba. Representative Sanford McGovern will have a similar bill in the House. President Obama recently eased these restrictions, but we need to do our part in Congress. It's not only the right thing for the Cuban people, it's the right thing for America. Americans shouldn't have restrictions on their freedom of travel. We don't restrict Americans from traveling to nations with whom we fought wars, such as Vietnam. And we don't restrict Americans from traveling to countries with troubling regimes, North Korea, Iran, Uzbekistan. And during the height of the Cold War, Americans were allowed to travel to the Soviet Union. So why not Cuba? Why do we still isolate this country? Some say, well, this is a repressive regime. We don't want to show recognition to this regime. Mr. President, it's just within this week that our president visited Saudi Arabia to attend the memorial service for the late king of that country. I would dare say there are aspects of the human rights policy of Saudi Arabia which aren't even close to American standards, and yet we consider them a valuable ally. There's also a lesson in history. When the Soviet Union started to come down, it was cracking on the edges in the Baltics, in the Warsaw Pact, and in other republics as they saw the outside world, saw the opportunity, saw the need for change. We have not prevailed with isolation. Let's engage the Cuban people. Let's engage their economy. Let's engage their minds into thinking about a 21st century far different than the dark days of communism which they've lived under for so many decades. I know that several of my colleagues here, particularly those of Cuban descent, have strong, strong personal and family feelings about our relationship with Cuba. I don't diminish that one bit. There is real suffering that has taken place by their families and many others. But I hope that we can look to the future and look to the next generation and look to the possibility that we can engage Cuba in a positive way. Ultimately, it will be this new flow of American engagement and ideas that will help open up Cuba and improve the lives of their people. Certainly, we ought to try something different. 50 years of isolation, those 50 years have not worked. Today, we're taking the first few steps on a path which I strongly support. Mr. President, I yield the floor.